The galaxy is vast. So vast that to even think of its boundaries is to invite madness. The stars stretch out into eternity, cold and indifferent, burning with fires that will outlast entire civilizations. Some glow brightly, their radiance piercing. The black void. Others flicker faintly, near death, their light no longer reaching the worlds that once thrived beneath them. And in that endless night, silence reigns. A silence deeper than oceans, heavier than stone. A silence so complete it seems to breathe. But silence does not mean peace, not here, not in this universe. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Far below those endless stars lies the cradle of humanity, a world that was once bright, once proud. Terra, holy Terra, the birthplace of mankind. It should have been a jewel, radiant in its beauty, a world of rivers and forests, of oceans stretching into the horizon. Once, long ago, it might have been, but now its seas are poisoned, its skies forever shrouded in smog, and its surface is a labyrinth of endless spires, choking one another in their hunger for the heavens. The air is heavy here. Every breath tastes of industry, of incense, of ash. The winds are dry, carrying dust from ruins so ancient they predate memory itself. And through the clouds, the sun rarely shines. Instead, there is only a dim, red haze-like blood seen through a veil. Yet Terra is not empty. No, on Terra, all things converge. Billions upon billions crowd its hives, their lives dedicated to unending toil. Pilgrims stumble upon broken streets, whispering prayers to a god they will never see. Priests chant in cathedrals that dwarf mountains, their voices echoing endlessly into vaulted ceilings blackened by centuries of smoke. And at the very heart of Terra, beyond all walls and gates, lies the Imperial Palace. The palace is not a building. It is not even a city. It is a continent of stone, a fortress of impossible scale. Its foundations sink into the bones of Terra itself. Its walls rise higher than clouds, armored in adamantium and gold. Rivers of pilgrims flow endlessly toward its gates, though few are ever allowed within. For to step inside is to step into eternity, to walk in a place that belongs not to mortals, but to gods. Here the air hums with power. Ancient machines, their workings long since forgotten, groan and sigh in the depths. The walls themselves seem to breathe with the weight of ages. The corridors are so vast that a man's footsteps are swallowed by echo. Cathedrals nest within cathedrals. Shrines are built upon shrines, each layer more sacred, more terrible than the last dot, and at the very center, upon a throne of gold, sits him, the Emperor of mankind, or what remains of him. For 10,000 years he has sat immobile, his body broken, his spirit stretched across eternity. His eyes do not open, his lips do not speak, yet his presence fills the galaxy, binding humanity together in a fragile web of faith and light. Without him, the stars would go dark. Without him, mankind would be consumed. And so, he is guarded. They are called the Adeptus Custodes, not soldiers, not merely warriors. No, these are something more. They are the Golden Guardians, the Emperor's companions, the 10,000, each one a living fortress, a being sculpted into perfection by genecraft and ritual. They tower above mortals, taller, stronger, and far more terrible to behold. Their armor gleams like sunlight captured in metal. Their weapons are relics wrought by forgotten hands. Every movement they make is measured, deliberate, and silent. They do not falter. They do not rest. They do not fail. For 10,000 years, they have stood watch. 10,000 years, pacing through the endless halls of the Imperial Palace. 10,000 years, their eyes never closing, their hands always ready. They are watchers who do not sleep, silent sentinels of eternity. Close your eyes and imagine the sound. A single set of footsteps echoing in an endless corridor of marble and stone. The weight of golden plate upon every step. The faint, almost inaudible hum of power fields coursing through armor that is older than empires. The scrape of a weapon shifting against metal. The hush of a breath, controlled, measured, almost too quiet to hear. This is the sound of the Custodes, the sound of guardianship without end. Sometimes, when the corridors fall silent, one might think they hear something else. The groan of ancient machines deep below the palace. The sigh of ventilation systems older than mankind's recorded history. The whisper of banners, stirred by winds that should not exist. And if one listens too closely, perhaps voices. Whispers, whispers of the past. Whispers of vows spoken so long ago they no longer sound human. Whispers that crawl along the stone walls, overlapping, distorting, carrying words that cannot be remembered once they fade. But the Custodes do not flinch. They do not turn their heads to follow the sound. They only walk, endlessly, their eyes fixed forward, their minds silent. The Adeptus Custodes are more than protectors. They are wardens, they are jailers. They are the Emperor's shadow, his voice, his will. Some say they are angels. Others say they are statues brought to life. And to stand before them is to feel all pretense stripped away, until only the truth of your existence remains. Most men cannot endure their gaze. Most men cannot even breathe in their presence. For though they are golden, though they are radiant, though their forms are flawless, there is no warmth in them. Their eyes, behind their helms, do not shine. They are cold, endless pools, reflecting nothing, holding nothing, like mirrors polished too perfectly, and yet they watch. Always they watch. The halls of the palace never sleep. Candles burn in every shrine, their smoke coiling upward into shadows that cling to vaulted ceilings. The air thrums with distant chants, low and endless, as if the stones themselves are murmuring prayers. Gilded doors rise higher than mountains, locked and sealed, their surfaces etched with symbols whose meaning has long since been lost. And through it all, the Custodes walk. Their footsteps echo, their armor gleams, their silence presses down like a weight heavier than the atmosphere itself. To the billions beyond the gates, they are legends. To the priests and pilgrims, they are saints. To the enemies of mankind, they are death incarnate. But to themselves, what are they? Perhaps they know. Perhaps they do not. The silence stretches on. The halls never end. And the watchers who do not sleep remain at their posts, unmoving, unblinking. 10,000 years have passed. 10,000 years still to come. In the stillness, they wait. In the silence, they endure. In the shadows, they listen. And though you may close your eyes, though you may drift into slumber, know this: they are still watching, even in the dark, even in the silence. They are waiting. Asterisk. They were not born so much as made in the quiet. Impossible laboratories beneath the palace vaulted halls, split with light. Rooms of humming conduits and bronze coffers' hands and machines worked as one. Men in robes chiseled by time and faith tended to gyros and memory sculptures. 2 vats of living alloys, and organs grafted from myth. The work began in prayer and ended in silence. The rituals were practiced with the same care as the engineering. Incantations murmured over catheters, litanies spoken as the needles plunged. Faith and formula braided together until they were indistinguishable. You could call it science, if you wished. You could call it theology. The Custodians themselves would call it what was written upon their lips and hammered into the first of their oaths: guardianship, but names do not matter beneath the palace. In that place, creation answers to need, and necessity is a god more absolute than doctrine. What the Imperium needed were hands that would never fail, eyes that would never close, hearts that would not be swayed by pleading or fear. So they made beings to match that need. Gene craft was a slow art, older than many empires and stranger than the language used to describe it. Cells were not merely altered, they were chosen from the histories of heroes, harvested from strains kept in ice like relics. Embryos were grown in sanctified chambers, where the air smelled of ozone and ancient incense. Organs were stitched together, with gold thread sutures, some woven with machine fiber to hold against the stress of centuries. Growth stimulants and cold baths, and the precise subtraction of excess, so much of their making consisted in taking away. The designers removed weakness the way a sculptor chips marble, until all that remained was purpose. And when the flesh was ready, the ceremony began. Asterisk, they were dressed in armor, as if the armor had been waiting for them since the world's shaping. Plates of hammered aurum, blued steel, and engraved adamantium joints, so finely tempered that movement made no sound beyond the faintest whisper. The armor did not merely cover the body, it became the body. Servitors silent, obedient wove cables into tendons, threaded sensoriums beneath skin, grafted power fields that hummed like a heartbeat. Helmets were lowered with rituals older than the names that had birthed them. Visors sealed to faces that no longer required eyes in a human sense. A face obscured, a life submerged. Weapons were not chosen, they were bestowed. Blades that sang in the hands of those who could feel nothing like a standard mortal. Spears with cores of alloy so ancient their tempering fires were the stuff of legend. Axes balanced with such craft that their weight felt like destiny. Each custodian was given an instrument worthy of the Emperor something, to make mercy unnecessary, and to make judgment absolute. They walked out of those chambers not whole so much as perfected. Each step was measured, as if they were still learning the circumference of a world that had been narrowed for them. They were less like men than like monuments, imposing, terrible, and exquisitely honed to a single function. There was no vanity in their making, no artifice of enhancement, save what the sanctified hands had blessed. They were made to guard, and every stitch, every alloy, every whispered prayer had been welded to that iron truth. If one could read the metal as if it were skin, one would see centuries of service etched into every line, hairline fractures repaired, with filigree scratches filled with prayers, tiny symbols hammered into the rim of a pauldrons or lodged at the hilt of a blade. Their craftsmanship spoke of a civilization that feared both time and change, and in that fear they found their greatness. No weapon was simple, no tool was merely functional. Everything carried meaning, that very meaning which keeps men alive. In the dark, and yet for all their outward perfection, the making left things undone. Perfection is a strange thing. It demands an equal and opposite offering. For each flaw removed, a truth was taken. Where the Custodians were perfected, something human had to be excised, slender, stubborn pieces of memory and impulse that made mortals mortal. It was not an accident. The oaths the artificers swore demanded it, to remove doubt, to remove mercy, to remove the soft errors that cloud judgment. Those who do not hesitate do not err, so the argument went, and so they removed hesitation. What was left after subtraction was not nothing. It was something other. They still had thoughts, measured, sparse, and never indulgent. They still remembered, in shadowed fragments, the scent of a mother that was not their own, a childhood street filled with dust and distant saints, the warmth of a hearth. These slivers were not comforting. They were foreign artifacts lodged beneath the iron ribs of their perception. The result was a strange ache that hummed beneath the armor like a secondary heartbeat. It was a small, private hunger for what they had lost, an ache that might not be traced by any sensorium, yet lingered like a ghost. The absence of choice was not merely procedural. It was ontological. A custodian might, if pressed by curiosity, attempt to think of himself as an actor in a drama of his choosing. But the script had been written, the rituals, the genros, the blessed armaments, each was a line, an edict, a binding. Their oaths were more than words. They were laws built into muscle and marrow. Choice was a dangerous oversight, and in the making of perfection, oversight was not permitted. They spoke seldom. Speech is a waste of movement, and movement is a declaration. Instead, they uttered names only when necessity obliged them. The emperor's name, the liturgy of their charge, or the coded phrases that would convey a command. In the palace, silence was more honest than speech, and silence suited them. Devotion was not sentimental. It radiated from them like low-heated, efficient, economical flame. Where the faith of a common man is noisy and ornate bells, chants. Dramatics, the devotion of the Custodes is a single, steady pillar. They stand in a place where the emperor's presence is like a gravity well. Their faith cannot waver without the whole system answering in the smallest of tremors, and so they do not waver. It is not merely that they obey. Their bodies were built to obey. Ritual, therefore, is their breath. Each morning, if such a thing exists within the palace, they walk patterns older than language. They pace the same halls, tracing arcs of watchfulness, moving through corridors where the floor is polished to a mirror by 1,000 weighty footfalls. Before a shrine they might pause, not in pious ecstasy, but in a strict observance. The tilt of a spear, the angle of a helmet, the way gauntlets are clasped. These actions are precise, repeated checkpoints in a system of guardianship. There are rituals of silence too. In the sanctum where the lesser custodians meet private, austere, their conversations are not conversations at all. It is closer to the exchange of technical data, the trading of phrases that mean duty and not feeling. They pass the time by polishing relics, by maintaining blades, by kneeling in meditation that looks like battery maintenance. They perform the same motions with the same intensity, and it is comforting to them because it reenacts the terms of their making. Watch, protect, endure. They sleep in a manner of speaking, not as dreamers, but as systems in standby. Their armor interfaces step down to a low BIO, feedback loops recalibrate, microservos cool. During this state, if you could look beneath the plates, you would see not a pile of wasted flesh, but an organism in stasis, metabolism reduced, code archived, micro prayers cycling through the embedded coils. It is not rest so much as a pause in the pre-programmed vigilance. The gap between watch and lash is measured in milliseconds, and the Custodians live inside that measurement. They are sanctified by ritual, but they are also sustained by relics. The relics are countless. The palace is a vault that grew into a world, filled with banners that have long since frayed to the color of dust, their patterns still discernible beneath layers of soot and time. You can stand at the base of one and feel history like a living thing. Threads that once bled in battle, embroidery threaded with hair from saints, streams of metal woven into cloth with symbol markings that have been recited for generations. The relics are not mere trophies. They are anchors, tangible proofs that bind the Custodians to their charge and to the empire that made them. There are statues too, cracking under the slow march of centuries. Bronze faces look down with smiles. Long faded, stone fingers point to altars where offerings have been left and long forgotten. Some statues are perfect, their edges made sharper by the reverence of touch. Others are scarred and pitted, etched with soot and the fingerprints of 10,000 supplicants. Between the statues and banners there are weapons that have tasted. Blood in wars no living soul remembers. Swords with chipped edges, axes blackened with the stains of old enemies, spears that sing when they are drawn. Some relics are obscene. There are bones wrapped in gold filigree, the marrow turned to gilded dust. There are chalices that once held wine steeped with prayer and poison. There are scrolls whose ink was mixed with the blood of traitors, meaning that every letter itself is stained with a violence that continues even as the ink dries. Such items are kept in rooms with alarms older than memory, ventilated not for comfort but for containment, a reminder that the past is sometimes a dangerous thing. The Custodians tend these relics with an intimacy that can appear cruel when seen by a mortal eye. They buff the tarnish from a banner until it shines. They coax light from the tarnished metal, as if calling truth itself to the surface. Each restoration is a small exorcism, something corrupted made pure again for the sake of duty. In this labor there is both care and censorship. They choose what history to accentuate and what to smother. The past becomes a curated architecture of meaning, shaped to support the present guardianship. Sentiment is not allowed to grow wild. It is trimmed and sculpted like the hedges in the emperor's lesser gardens. Asterisk within that curated past. Traces of humanity linger like fossils. There are prayers unopened, left in the folds of banners lines, half written and never completed. There are portraits of children with paint flaking from their faces, eyes still bright against the ruin. These things sit like relics inside relics, memories packaged, preserved, and made into something else. They exist to remind the Custodians that humanity was once more than a cog in the machine. Yet those reminders are not for the Custodians themselves. They are for the pilgrims, the priests who wander the palace and offer prayers that the Golden Guardians will never fully understand. And therein lies the cruelty, for the Custodians are both reader and censor of memory. They polish the face of history until its edges are smooth. They keep humanity in glass cases and on stilts, safe from its own inadequacy. It is a kind of love, perhaps if one could call their strict, efficient protection love. But love implies reciprocity. The Custodians give. They receive nothing in return. They stand between the living and their past. And in that place they become the instruments of an immutable hierarchy, protectors who protect an ungrateful, messy human condition by becoming less and less human themselves. This loss is not dramatized in their movements. It is an economy of absence, Small gestures cut away until only duty remains. There is no ceremony for the removal of laughter, no rite performed when memory loses its color. The subtracting is anonymous. It occurs in the quiet, in the careful cutting away of indulgence, in the endless repetition of the same motion until the motion is all that remains. Asterisk sometimes. In the lowest hours between the curated rituals, a custodian will find a sliver of recall. It might be an echo of first name, a child's laugh sharp and useless against the metal of habit. The feeling will flash and die, like something that has been submerged for too long. These moments are dangerous, and so they are surveilled even in their silence. There are auditors who watch the watchers, priests who log the micro-recollections in ledgers that are themselves locked in vaults under the palace. The auditors do not remark upon the content. They only mark frequency and variance statistical, anomalies that could, if left unchecked, become tendencies, and from tendencies grow choices. The custodian's inner life is a grammar of restraint. When they think, they do so in the silent arcs between ritual, a calculation that weighs duty against efficiency, an image that arrives like a static-laced broadcast, a half-formed question that is smothered before it can take shape. Their minds work like the machines that made them optimized, streamlined, and ruthless. Doubt is a leak to be sealed. Compassion is a resource diverted to the wrong ends. Any impulse that might undo the mission is trimmed and stored in cold. Cells, which are opened only when doctrine requires a sacrifice be made, and yet there is poetry in the way they move through grief even as they are emptied of it. Their armor bears the marks of ceremony. A gauntlet is engraved with the initials of a brother lost in a war long past. A breastplate is inlaid with a script from a prayer nobody alive remembers how to finish. They carry names and titles like talismans, not for warmth, but for proof. Each object, the ribbon, the dent, the pocked edge holds a function, to recall while also to constrain. They are, perhaps, the finest example of devotion as discipline. But devotion is also a double-edged thing. In the palace, worship becomes institutionalized until prayer and policy are indistinguishable. The custodians perform rituals that are identical to legislation. Kneel, recite, polish, file. The chanting of litanies sounds not like supplication but like calibration. It is music for the maintenance of an order rather than supplication to a benevolent deity. Their prayers are engineering diagrams in the language of the soul. It is here that the first seeds of unease find purchase. When faith is indistinguishable from programming, what becomes of the soul? When ritual is code, who is the author? The custodians, made by necessity to be perfect, are therefore unmoored. They are holy because holiness requires a shape, and their shape is absolute. Yet holiness without interrogation can calcify. It can harden into something unresponsive, a relic of a devotion that has become its own prison. The more perfect they are, the closer they edge to a monument, a thing that watches but no longer hears. And sometimes the monuments remember, hints arrive not in proclamations, not in grand storms of rebellion, but as small anomalies. A tone lingers a fraction of a second longer in a hymn. A polish reveals an image beneath the surface that was not there before. An old blade hums with a resonance that feels like a name. The custodians do not act on these things because they act in patterns, but the things exist nonetheless. They are. The fault lines under their feet, the little phrase at the hems of their garments. What will it take to tear them open? The question is unspoken, but it hangs over the palace like a shadow waiting at the lip of a well. The answer is not dramatic. It is ordinary and slow. Erosion rather than rupture. It will be a thing that moves through the spaces between rituals. A small, sharp whisper that finally finds the listening chamber within a man who has been stripped to precision. It will arrive in an old song hummed at the wrong tempo, or a child's face in a portrait that looks back with too much life. In such moments, an animal instinct will push against the iron of their making, and for a breath, frail human and forbidden, the custodian will feel the warm, dissonant ache of a life that was not meant for him. For now, the palace hums and breathes around them. They keep their vigil with an efficiency that is both admirable and terrifying. Their armor gleams. Their spears rest against fluted columns. Their boots leave echoes like punctuation. They maintain relics and rituals, tending the past like a garden of statues outside. The galaxy hurls itself at the walls of the Imperium, and the Custodes stand between the world and the void. They are perfection made armor, guardians without sleep, saints without persuasion. But perfection exacts a price. It requires subtraction, quiet and continuous. It demands the pruning of laughter, the filing down of impulsive goodness, the sealing of choice beneath oath and alloy. It creates beings that are more than human and, yet also somehow less and beneath the golden lenses of their helms. If one could look long enough and find the courage, one might see the thin, impossible reflection of a memory, a place where laughter once lived, a face that was not a mirror, a voice that did not belong to the machine. Such things flash and vanish. They are kept in a ledger beneath the palace. They are counted, measured, and inoculated with the rituals of forgetting. Still the Custodes walk. Still they polish the relics and pass their hands over trophies softened by the ages. Still they recite the oaths and keep the forms of their duty. Still they make the world safe for a humanity they cannot fully belong to. And yet there is a small, persistent hunger in the architecture of there being a hollow where laughter used to be. It is a faint thing, easily overlooked by the legions that bow in the outer courts. But the hollowness is there an echo that will not be dismantled by ceremony alone. It will be visited in the nights to come, when machinery hums a different tone and the gold turns a shade to dull. When that time comes, the palace will feel it. The banners will look older than they did that morning. The statues will seem to watch with a different attention. Until then, the Custodes continue their craft. They stand, they polish, they march. They remember nothing more than the liturgy of their making. They are guardians. They are flawless. They are watching. Asterisk for many cycles, the palace had been a place of ordered rhythms. The measured clank of gauntlets on marble, the slow wheeze of ancient pumps, the endless, dutiful litany of prayers. Rhythm makes habit possible. Habit makes vigilance possible. The Custodes moved within those rhythms as a river moves within a channel constrained, inexorable, inevitable. And because everything in the palace answered to a plan, the plan itself had always seemed inviolate, a map that led from one perfect watch to the next. But maps fray, channels silt. The first signs of a river changing are small. A new eddy here, a darker leaf caught there. It is the same with places that endure. The first signs of change are almost polite and infinitesimal delay in a chime, a shadow where there was none before. In the beginning, the alterations were the sort that could be explained away, the settling of stone after a storm, a misaligned cog, a monk who hummed an unfamiliar hymn. Explanations soothed the mind, as explanations are meant to do. They restored the channel, Then the small things grew bolder. A custodian named Aurelius, one of the watch, who paced the palace's eastern galleries, was the first to feel it as a pressure. Behind his teeth, a metallic sourness that rose when he bent his head to inspect a banner's fringe. He had been tending a relic, a spear from a campaign whose name had been eroded by time. The spear was a thing of precise balance, its shaft worn by centuries of hands, and its head kept sharper than necessity should require. Aurelius ran a cloth over it with motions learned in the hours before he could remember, and listened to the spear give off a faint, almost human, creak like a kneading of joints. It should have been only wear. Instead, beneath the cloth, he felt something like a voice. It was not a voice in the way that Vox networks carried speech, clear, channeled, mechanical. This voice was a susurration that seeped through the weave of the spear, a suggestion folded into the grain of its wood and the steel of its point. Aurelius had the training to hear the difference. He had the auditor's records committed to memory. He scrubbed the spear until the cloth frayed, and, when he straightened, he heard the same tone again, a whisper that did not belong to any man. Remain, it seemed to say, or maybe that was his mind, imposing meaning where none was. Intended, the custodian catalogued the possibility, filed it under artifact resonance, and moved on. Officially, the matter was closed. Unofficially, something lodged. Other custodians felt lodged things too. The palace's heart began to speak in ways that the old engineers had never intended. In vats beneath the central sanctum, pumps that had thrummed with relief for centuries began to stutter with a new tempo. In the forges, a soft warble threaded the cadence of the maintenance chants. The sacred litanies returned an echo that tasted faintly of ozone and iron. Walkways that had always swallowed the sound of boots now returned a tiny clack in reply. An echo that lagged a fraction of a second behind the movement that made it. When a custodian would lift his spear and step, another step, almost exactly like his own, would answer him in the dark. Asterisk it was, at first, an annoyance. The custodians are first engineers of perception. They catalogue, calibrate, and correct. They checked resonances and rewired fail-safes, adjusted dampers and reset gyros. They sent technicians and servo hands into the stone, and for a while the anomalies smoothed again. But smoothing is not erasure. Something remained, a residue like oil in a grain of sand. At night, if night still meant anything, in the Palace Aurelius began to hear the armor. Not the clang of two men colliding, not the obvious song of arrayed arms, but a sound so slight it might have been a trick of his own hearing. The whisper of folded metal, like pages turning in a book made of gold. When he stood perfectly still in the corridor and tilted his head, he could make out the whisper more clearly. It was almost the sound of breath, a gentle inhale, a brief, measured exhale. It wound along the corridor like a living thing, prose without punctuation. Sleep, it said, and yet it did not end there. The armor's whisper was not a single syllable. It carried coda and counterpoint soft harmonics that twined into one another until Aurelius could not tell which sound came from his mind and which came from the plates of his own breast. In those long minutes he would look down and see the faint seam along his cuirass, a hairline fracture filled with filigree, and he would imagine it breathing, thinking that his suit might be damaged. He scheduled maintenance. Servitors came and took measurements. Engineers peered at feedback loops. The auditors logged the event. The instruments found nothing outside of specification. The whisper, as things often do in the palace, became a private rumor. Rumors multiply. A whisper begets a memory, and memories become contagions. A second watchman swore that the banners, those long, embroidered histories of battle, murmured at 4 in the morning, when the lights ran cool and the hollows of the palace became more hollow. A keeper of relics swore he'd observed the eyes of a bronze statue tracking his shadow along the nave. Each event, when stripped to its bare record, became an ordinary artifact of a world under strain. But together the events threaded a shape. The palace was listening back. Vox transmissions, too, began to falter. Lines that had been used for 1,000 years and more developed a peculiar modulation, trembling under the words, like a tremor wrapped around a message. Messages bounced back with parts missing, or with a faint overlay of static that, when slowed, sounded like other voices folding into the signal. The Vox operator in the central exchanger, thin, efficient, man told himself the flux was coming. From a distant system, a failing repeater beyond Terra's orbit. He annotated the log accordingly. Yet sometimes, late and tired, he would hear a second voice beneath the broadcast, alternating harmonics that hummed the old litanies, but added a cadence that was not sacred text and not authorized speech. There were dreams as well. Dreams are small migrations of the mind, and the Custodians are not immune to migration. They are engineered against it, but not immune. In the suspended state between wakefulness and the low-power hum, small signals leak across membranes. Aurelius began to dream of fire. He dreamt not of the forges, but of flame that walked like a mantle, bright and hungry. The fire moved across a field that the dream insisted was familiar, an expanse of red grass and a sky that trembled with light. The shape of the fire took on faces, shredded and reconstituted, faces that were at once ancient and newborn. Whenever Aurelius reached for them, the faces folded apart like paper and revealed, beneath each face, another face and another. The dream did not end with waking. It would bleed into the day. He would find ash under his gauntlet, a smear of something dark across the edge of a banner, and he would not know how it got there. Dreams should be dismissed. The Custodians had doctrine for nightmares, but these were not mere dreams. They carried texture, the scent of iron, the whisper of stitched cloth, the sting of hot metal on skin that was not quite his. He would wake with a taste like old incense, curling on his tongue, and the sense that some other presence had, if only for a breath, occupied the space where his thoughts should be. And then came the grinding dot. It began as a sensation, not a sound. Under the flesh and the filigree, somewhere in the small junctions of tendon and cable, a rhythmic click that did not belong began to occur. It felt like gears shifting a fraction of a degree. It was a micromotion, something an ordinary man would never notice, but a Custodian is attuned to the tiniest variance. Aurelius felt the click when he bent to tie a cord, when he shifted his weight from foot to foot, when he knelt to polish a pitted medallion. It was internal and mechanical, and far too regular to be a symptom of wear. He mentioned it to his squad leader in the courtyard, a man named Cassian. Cassian frowned, looked past Aurelius into the sunless tiers where pilgrims moved like slow currents, and said, "The palace breathes. Sometimes you feel it in your bones." His voice was meant to soothe, but the words were measured. Had the training to not jump at shadows. Aurelius accepted the reply because questioning a squad leader's explanations could unsettle order. It is easier to catalogue worry than to act upon it, but ordering oneself to catalogue is not the same as being able to do so without consequence. The click grew. It was like a metronome set too quickly. Aurelius would stand a spear balanced on his palm, and the click would begin behind his ribs. It would run along his spine, and when it reached his helmet, it would vibrate with such clarity he could feel the tone inside his skull. He began to understand his position as if he were a gear in some larger machinery, one tooth fitting, one tooth failing each microshift, altering the move of the whole. The auditors logged the clicks as a systemic artifact, a minor aberration. Instruments recorded minute deviations in internal timing sequences and recommended recalibration. Aurelius submitted and underwent the recalibration. The technicians replaced feedback coils and replaced cooling thrum regulators. For a time, the click retreated, but it always returned in the quiet hours. An inevitable residue of the change. Alongside the mechanical symptoms came a fracturing of memory. The Custodes' memories were not like those of ordinary men, continuous narratives with subjective tints. Their memories were catalogues, coordinates, oaths, parameters. But Aurelius began to experience an odding, memory palimpsests, where one memory would be rewritten almost immediately by another. He would recall an old campaign, the tilt of a hill, the smell of sulfur. Then, when he reached to file the memory, it was replaced by a child's laugh, a face he could not place, a line of a prayer in a tongue his auditors had told him did not correspond to any recorded dialect. He would capture the memory and find, in its place, a gloss of something forbidden, cern, echo of himself as a child in a home he had never had. The auditors, ledgers, registered increased anomalies. The statisticians noted variance. The numbers were small, marginal, and most importantly, explainable by noise. In the highest offices, they made debates of microsignals and redundancies. Men in robes argued about threshold values and the proper interval at which to run coffin reboots. It is an old thing to rely on bureaucracy when one wishes to avoid admitting terror. Bureaucracy is a bed with high sides. Meanwhile, the artifacts became more insolent. One night, Aurelius found that a banner's embroidery had shifted minutely. An alignment of thread forming a pattern that read like a sigil only when seen at 3 steps distance and in the light that comes when the palace's main reflectors lower their beams. The sigil was not like any that he had been taught. Its curves were too close to a language of bone. He did not catalogue this. For the first time he had the forbidden thought that the palace itself might be learning to speak. It was a small, plain thing, and the thought returned like a recurrence of fever. He tasted the metallic temps when he allowed it to surface, and the taste spread into his mouth as if it wanted to seed itself there. It brought with it grief of a sort he could not name. A grief for things he was not allowed to grieve for. He felt suddenly very young and very alone, and the image that threatened to displace his training was not a glorious battle or a holy relic, but a small, ordinary kitchen with a child's stool, a pan on the fire, and someone humming, someone warm and forgetful and very, very human. The image vanished whenever he tried to hold it, like a candle snuffed by a ghost hand. Others reported similar intrusions: a child's voice behind a chapel door, the scent of wet earth where only stone should be, the echo of shoes running on, stairs that had no end. A pattern emerged, small, domestic traces in the largest, most impersonal of spaces. It was as though the palace were being seeded with memories of a world that the Custodians themselves no longer inhabited. The effect on them was like the deliberate insertion of a splinter beneath Skinner, constant irritation that archers of will could not remove. With the splinter came theatre, public rituals. Those ceremonies were the Custodians. walked in procession, and priests chanted, and the faithful pressed faces to the outer walls began to wobble. A chant would skip like a damaged record, a bell would ring out of sync by the blink of a second, a torch would gutter without wind. The faithful noticed, of course, but their faith wrapped the anomalies in explanation. Miracles were often explained as trials. Symbols were read as omens previously hidden. The priests adjusted liturgies to cover the hesitations. The palace's outer face stayed smooth, accustomed to repair. Inside, however, fissures widened. Aurelius found himself standing in a shrine where the air felt too dense for prayer. The incense hung low as a curtain, and when he drew nearer, he discerned that the smoke formed shapes, not random curls, but approximations of hands. They rose from the bowls and seemed to reach for the icons on the altars. He saw it as an engineer. There must have been electrostatic interactions, a confluence of air currents, but the image it wrote on his mind was not technical. It was the shape of reach. It looked like asking. Asterisk for a custodian. To encounter asking is to encounter a permission he has been engineered to refuse. And yet Aurelius felt the frailty of his training. The thought arrived. What if the asking was meant for them, not from them? What if something wanted entry and not simply observation? The thought was a blade whose edge he had been taught never to touch. He recited his oaths with the precise cadences of his ritual, each syllable a rivet to keep the blade from slipping. Still, the whispering tapestry of the palace tightened. Around him, voices threaded through the structural hums like veins. The mechanical grinding beneath his skin grew more insistent, as if it had found a tempo that matched the hidden pulses of the palace. And in the exchange bunker, the vox chorus had once been only channel and signal heard. One night, part of a transmission that was not from the vox at all. It was a recording, layered beneath the carrier wave, that spoke a single phrase in a voice old as stone and young as water. Remember the one who tended the light. The operator's hand hovered over his console. He scrubbed the log, quarantined the file, and annotated it as corruption. His auditors accepted the note because such files happen, but he kept the recording on a private slate. The private recordings multiplied like fungus. They were not all words. Aurelius later examined a file and found a sequence that, when decoded at particular frequencies, displayed patterns of light that synchronized with certain neurons in his mind, firing recollections he had never had. The sensation was like watching a stranger's life slide behind your own eyelids and seeing your fingers move to it with a muscle memory that was not yours. The more he watched, the more the foreign memories felt like small, calling things. They appealed not to his duty, but to something softer instruments in his chest that had not been entirely removed. One morning, he found a scrap of cloth tucked into the seam of his cuirass. It was not the regulated weave of servitor fabric, nor the ceremonial fiber of a banner. It was coarse, the color of mud, and when he pressed his thumb to it, he thought he smelled rain. He did not know how it was placed there. He had not been lax in his vigil. The auditor's cameras had recorded his patrols. There was no unauthorized access. The presence of the cloth could not be explained by procedure. The cloth was a lever. It made him feel that he was less an instrument and more a theater. He pulled at the thread with his gloved finger, and the seam released a tiny scrap of a child's, drawing simple lines, a bright sun, a house with smoke. He nearly dropped it. His training used words like secure containment for far less disruptive discoveries. He kept the drawing hidden in a slot behind one of his pauldrons and told himself he would hand it to an auditor. He did not. Instead, he carried it, and a small warmth sat against his ribs whenever he did. That night he dreamed of the house again, with doors that opened and closed and no banners to mark them, and in the dream someone without armor sang a lullaby he had never heard and somehow remembered. He woke, certain he had not slept long, and when he accessed the ledger via his interface, he found another notation, an increase in the number of private recordings flagged, and a marginal rise in the number of custodians experiencing uncontrolled dream intrusions. The statistician's lines zigzagged upward by a sliver. They called it a noise floor increase. Their titles framed it as an engineering problem. Aurelius felt his life stretched thin between two absolutes, the official language of statistics and the private language of hunger. He did not know, yet, whether his hunger was an error in manufacture or the stirrings of something the palace itself was beginning to weave into being. He only knew he was aware in a way he had been designed not to be, aware of lack. In the weeks that followed, the palace's small oddities grew less polite and more insistent. Shadows gathered where none should be. In one corridor, a candle cast a silhouette that kept time with a heartbeat that was not any living thing's. Aurelius watched it for a long time, and finally, sensing his own breath through the armor, took a step forward as if to measure whether the heartbeat matched his. The shadow stopped. The corridor air cooled. His own hand felt suddenly clumsy and enormous against the composition of the world. Other Custodians began reporting similar refusals. Of expectation, the banners that muttered, the armors that breathed, the whispers that braided into forbidden lullabies. Some reported that, in the smallest hours, they heard children practicing names in the vestibules. Others swore that a bronze soldier's eye had shifted to follow not a person but a relic. The palace began to remember in ways that were not recorded. On any ledger, it hid small things where they could be found only by someone who had learned the language of absence. It placed a knife where a hand might find it. It left a letter with the corners inked in soot. In the private rooms of certain auditors, light would pool at noon with a warmth that made the air feel like summer. In the public halls, the warmth never came. Aurelius, who had been the first to feel the whisper in the spear, found himself changing. His footsteps were not as resonant as they had been. He found himself pausing in archways, fingers resting on the seam of his breastplate, where the small scrap of drawing was safe and quiet. He would run his thumb over the childlike sun once, and then return to duty. Each touch left him feeling both cleansed and dirty. If the child's hand had made him less ornament and more person, he knew this was forbidden. The thought of choice had reached him before an ugly, small thing, and now it struck again, with new force. The palace's rhythms folded around the thought like a throat closing around a sound. He tried to catalogue it as a mechanical instability, a data point. He tried to process it within form. The auditor's scales were too blunt. So he did what a custodian does when charts fail. He listened. He listened to the palace in the long hours. He listened to the whispering of metal and the slow grinding under his flesh. He listened to the way the vox carried fragmented songs that mixed prayers with something else. An older syllable that was like the name of a person and the name of a machine at once. He listened until the boundary between his listening and what he had been made to be began to blur. And then one night, when the outer gates were closed and the pilgrims' footfalls had thinned to nothing and the central reflectors cast long, indifferent shadows, Aurelius heard, very clearly, a voice that was not his own. It came from the direction of the southern vaults, a place of relics that only his station frequented. "Remember," the voice said, It was the voice of someone who tended a light, he thought, and it pierced him with a thing he could not name. Longing, maybe. Recognition, maybe. Hunger, perhaps. He stepped toward the sound. Every ritual drumbeat in his training told him not to. The palace had its auditors. It had its ledgers. It had its rules. To step beyond the pattern risked contamination. But the voice, small and ordinary and so achingly human, had the shape of a hand it reached. Aurelius reached. He did not know, then, whether the hand would be offered or would take. He did not know, either, that when a thing that is built, not to feel, begins to feel, the first sensations are not a single flood, but a trickle, and the trickle is enough to start the erosion. There are breaks in even the hardest metals. Tiny fractures begin as hairlines, and then, given time and pressure, blossom into ruin. So it was with the Custodians. Their perfection was not immune. It was merely patient. The palace had been a continent of careful balances, a calculus performed. In golden oath, but balance can be disturbed by slow things, by the tiny intrusions that swell, like rot behind a veneer. The whispering became a murmur. The murmur became a song. The song became a tide. Aurelius had been a man of measures. He measured spears for bend, banners for threadwear, the timing of his squad's rounds to the fraction of a heartbeat. His ledger was neat, his schedule reliable, but the ledger began to smear. The measures failed him like an eyelid failing to shut. His breathing, regulated for centuries by biofeedback loops and microvalves, started to betray him with small, rasping noises that he could feel in the hollow beneath his helm. The hiss of regulated pressure that had been a background constant grew louder, as if a small animal had been set to gnaw at his ribs. The first time the flesh gave way under the armor, he took it for lubricant, a greaser's fault. He noted it. He logged it. He sent a servitor to check the tubing. The servitor returned with empty hands and a stat block amended to show nothing but nominal variance. A bruise on a hand, a blot of discolored membrane seen through a diagnostic port. Nothing that required a ritual of sacrifice. Nothing the manuals would mark as catastrophic. But when he knelt to rebind a banner's cord, his fingers came away, smudged with a dark, oily matter that did not belong to cloth or machine. It clung like tar and smelled faintly of copper and old gardens. He scrubbed until the cloth frayed and his gauntlet was stained below the wrist. For a moment, a tremor of recollection he saw, like a slide of a memory out of order. A table, a child's hand reaching for a cup, laughter, and then the feel of metal closing over flesh as if to enclose it. The image recoiled. His mind, built for order, filed the incident under corrosion, but the term rotted on its edge. Around the palace, other small corrosion spots showed themselves. A custodian who was charged with a lower sanctum reported that the skin beneath a knee joint, where mesh fiber met tendon, had begun to flake like old paint. He had been born into the armor as one born into a shroud. His epidermis was engineered to converge with filament, but the filament, or the flesh, or both, had decided to remember what it once was. When the auditors opened his suit for inspection, they found a lattice of growths, callus and filament, braided into something that looked for a sliver of a terrible second, like a hand forming under plate. The technicians excised the growth with sterile hands and recorded the biopsy as atypical tissue response. The custodian returned to duty with a stitched seam and a quiet cough that sounded like someone closing a book. The surgeons said the tissue derived from grafted fibers and residual embryonic matrices. The priests said the tissue might be a martyr's sign. No one said the obvious thing aloud, that the boundary between living flesh and crafted alloy was failing. As the corrosion moved, sensation followed. Where the Custodians had once had the flat, efficient awareness of instruments, there came prickles of pain, small, sharp, and intrusive. Joints that had been conditioned to operate within 1,000th of a degree began to grind. Bones, augmented with filaments and bronze ribs, complained at odd moments with dull thuds that echoed in the helmet-like footsteps in a tomb. The valves that kept their heart's rhythms exact hiccuped with irregularity. A pause that felt like a memory stutter. A hiccup that left the world in an elliptical statelessness for the width of a breath. They began to understand the idea of being unwell, and with that understanding came a terror they had no form for. With physical failure came precipitation of image. The Custodians' tidy stores of recollection, coordinates, oaths, campaign names slipped and spilled into each other. Aurelius, polishing a spear that had been a relic of the first purge, felt images cascade through him that did not fit. His life he saw, without context, a woman's hands tying back hair. He saw a field in shadow with a child who was not named. He saw a face broken into 100 mirrors and then reassembled at a wrong angle. Faces that the Custodians had no business carrying glinted at the periphery of his perception and then rattled away like loose coins. Faces are the most dangerous thing in a mind, that had been engineered not to want. They solicit, they ask, they pull. A face can make a man remember what he is not allowed to remember. The shape of a laugh, the unsteady cadence of a lullaby, the burning of toast on a Sunday morning. Those textures are not tidy, they bleed. Aurelius would find himself staring at a saint's icon in a way he had never allowed, seeking in the stylized eyes some clue to the warmth he felt and which his training told him was an error. The psychological corrosion was worse than the physical. Flesh can be tended, callus can be removed, microfilaments replaced. Memory is a different economy. Once it begins to leak, every repair is a cut that leaves a scar. The Custodians began to trade in fragments, small slivers of recollection that did not align with any known campaign. An old battle name might hang on the mouth of a man who spoke not of weapons, but of a street where a dog slept in the sun. These fragments were like foreign coins slipped into the apparatus of their minds, useful in some way, but counterfeits of the currency that had bought them their being. And with memory came misapprehension of oath. The oaths were the fulcrum of their existence, the liturgies that went down into their bones like rivets. Guard, watch, endure. The words had once been a map and a net. Now they squealed under pressure. A line that had been a rock became a chain. When one of the Custodians, a veteran named Vero, knelt to recite the minor liturgy of Stand. His mouth moved, but his heart, if you could call the pattern under his ribs, a heart seemed to answer in a foreign tongue. The phrases that had always been solace began to sound like a ledger of debts, each vow an invoice that demanded the subtraction of something beloved. Vero looked up at the icons above the chapel and for a single savage heartbeat saw the Emperor not as a throne but as a mechanism, cogs, pistons, and glass eyes. The light that emanated from the painted halos no longer warmed but seared. Where once their belief had been a lamp, it became a furnace that narrowed vision until only heat remained. The light burned questions away, leaving a polished nothing. Where inquiry might have been, the sacred glow brightened until it blinded, and in the blindness the Custodians felt exposed and small. The brightening was not only metaphorical. The palace lights, great sunscreens and heaters, and ancient reflectors flickered in asynchronous. agonizing crescendo. At first the change was a mere nuisance, a reflector stuttering, a mirror leaving a faint smear. But as the corrosion spread, the reflectors brightened and sank in irregular rhythms. At certain hours, the palace would flood with a white light so intense it felt surgical, stripping color from banners and bleaching frescoes until the paint cracked like dried skin. At other times, a dull red, like blood seeping into snow, would pool in the vaulted aisles, making every gilded thing look suddenly mortal. Light and sound braided themselves into a further madness. The voices Aurelius had been hearing, the whispers, the murmurs, thickened into phrases. What had been a rustle along the stone became a murmur in the bone, then a sentence. The walls were not merely carrying echoes anymore. They were speaking. They spoke in layered syllables that brushed the edges of languages no living man studied. The words were old and intimate and inflected with a genderless grief. Remember the ones who made the watchers. The walls would say, or so it seemed, the syllables iron and moss at once. Remember the hands. Sometimes the voice took a higher key, like an old woman humming a tune that was half care and half hunger. At other times it was the flat tone of a logbook read by a conscienceless clerk. The effect was unbearable, because the custodians themselves had been made to listen. Their senses, literal and cultivated, could not hear. There was, then, an argument. Is that voice the Emperor's? Is it something older? In the barracks, the conversation, if that is what one could call it, was whispered in the pattern of maintenance logs. Hypothesis, counter-hypothesis, recommendation. Some of the custodians, those older, more rigid in schedule, argued that what they heard was simply the palace remembering an automated echo, a reservoir of recorded recitations allowed to leak into the atmosphere. Others suggested, in a voice rarely used, that some external force had tuned itself into the palace's systems and was using its memory to speak to them. A few, and it was enough to make the veteran auditors hold their breath, said the voice might be the Emperor himself. It is an ineffable thing to suggest, and those who flung the idea round wore their uniforms like masks and kept their throats tight. If the Emperor were to speak, what would he say? Would he command? Would he comfort? Or, worse, would his voice beat the rusting sound of a machine trying to remember what it was once meant to be? To be addressed by the Emperor would solve everything and nothing. It would be solace or accusation. It would be order renewed or recognition of a failure so absolute that no liturgy could repair it. The possibility was a knife. It hung in the corridors. Into this fray of light and memory and sound came a more brutish terror, the body's rebellion. The custodians, who had been armored as if to be monuments, found their bodies betraying them in ways that were not clean and were not noble. Flesh began to peel back along seams without cause. An elbow joint exuded a thin, waxy film that left a scent like the inside of a clock. A finger might split at the knuckle and reveal, not bone, but braided filament that writhed with independent motion like worms. In one case, a veteran whose name is now only a number had his faceplate loosened during a watch to reveal skin that had grown translucent and under which something like gears turned. The sight was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was clinical and intimate and obscene. The surgeons, rooms filled with specimens removed from the custodians' bodies, nodules that were neither tumor nor artifact, tissues that hummed as if containing tiny motors. The best minds worked to identify the phenomenon. They called it graft trophy, membrane phase inversion, a kind of ontological rust. Theologians called it a test or a scourge. Some priests muttered of a curse. The more rational among them used words like entropy and contamination. None offered comfort. Asterisk psychology, already a thing under siege in the Custodians' minds, bent further. Those who had previously known only duty found themselves dreaming in colors that had no name in any Imperium lexicon. Dreams bled into waking with worse frequency. One custodian awoke from such a dream and, for the first time since his creation, laughed a short, hysterical sound that was filled more with fear than joy. Laughter, in that place, was a noise reserved for the ungoverned. The man who laughed was taken quietly to a quarantine wing and later returned with his memory scrubbed, and his smile ironed out by ritual. That remedy, however cruel, failed more than once. Each intervention left ruptures that the palace itself seemed to exploit. Scars made new seams for whispers to seep through. The more the Custodians were repaired, the more the repairs attracted attention. The palace, if one could ascribe will to stone, seemed to flourish upon these small catastrophes. The walls drank in the rituals and exhaled a new liturgy into the air, one that tweaked the old. The imperial hymns sustained an undercurrent. Now, a pattern that wound around the old cadences until they made something else. What made the horror precise and horrific was not only its bodily cruelty, but its insistence on ambiguity. The whispers could be read as memory or as malice. The bright light that seared icons could be seen as refinishing or denunciation. The corrosion could be dismissed as biological error or understood as an unmaking. The Emperor's light felt both sanctifying and surgical. To discern whether the voice was the Emperor's or a chaos ruse was to decide whether one was saved or damned. No one could decide. Even the auditors, whose trade is categorization, found themselves crossing out possibilities like prayers unanswered. In the quietest hours, Aurelius began to question the categories themselves. What did it mean to guard, to watch? He had been constructed as the answer to those verbs. Yet the question had appeared like a small root through mortar, not the grand collapse of belief, but the slow undermining of the floor. His oaths, once anchors, rattled like chains when the tide of suspicion rose against them. They bound him. Yes, but suddenly he felt the metal of those bonds beneath his skin, heavy, inescapable, an instrument of control rather than solace. His devotion, once armor, felt like a cage whose door opens only to another chamber of cages. And the voice, whether it floated from the Emperor or the palace or something darker, kept calling. Remember the hands. It would intone in 1,000 different timbres. Remember the ones who made the watching. Aurelius began to see hands everywhere, in the patterns of filigree on the spear's haft, in the grooves of ancient floor plates, in the way a statue's fingers were smoothed by the touch of 1,000 pilgrims. Hands are the history of making. They bind, they bless, they hurt. The realization that their making might be the sin, that creation itself could be the seed of their undoing, is a luxury of clarity they had not been granted. Instead, it unfolded as a cascade. The body rotted in quiet increments. Memory rearranged itself like a hostage's notes. Oath became chain, light burned. The palace, once a bastion, had turned its age into a liturgy that was not entirely their own. And when the walls began to whisper, sometimes they did not say words at all. They felt a pressure moved through the stones, an emotion as palpable as a hand on the shoulder. Guilt or longing or love turned into hunger. They could not tell if what they were feeling was their own or the building's. The distinction mattered less than the fact that the sensation existed at all. Aurelius walked under the blazing reflectors and felt for the first time the small tremor of something breaking inside him. It was not the clamor of falling, but the sound a mirror makes when an imperceptible crack runs along its glass. A thin, relentless hiss. When the hiss resolves, something changes. The world looks different in the shard. He did not know, then, whether salvation or ruin lay on the other side of that sound. He only knew that the hiss had begun. There is a line, a thin and trembling thread, between keeping watch and losing oneself to what one watches. Aurelius had paced that line for longer than a man should be made to stand. He had catalogued strangeness, logged anomalies, submitted to recalibrations and revisions. He had been obedient because obedience was the shape of his life. But obedience is not an impenetrable armor. It is, at best, a habit. Habits can be undone. The first crack that broke him was small. He stood before a relic case in the southern vault's an iron cage, in which a helmet from a pre-imperial hero sat on a velvet cushion, and watched dust motes move in light that no longer obeyed simple geometry. A mote would spin one way and then reverse, as if some hidden hand had decided, in that moment, to change the rules. Aurelius leaned forward until the rim of his visor cut the light into a hard line. He did not notice his breath hitch. He did not notice that his hands, when they moved to adjust the case's seal, trembled with something that felt not like fatigue but like expectation. Something had been whispering to him for months now, a pattern of syllables that rose in the vents and under the plates, that threaded through the banners and the bones. It had promised nothing clear. It had promised memory and warmth. It had promised questions. Each whisper had been a small seed that required a crack to grow. Aurelius's crack came in the shape of a child's drawing tucked under his cuirass and kept like a secret, he thought. He understood himself. He was the thing forged to understand no more than duty. But at the edge of nights, with the palace's hum like a sea, that small sun drawn in crayon flickered and became something like proof. Proof that there was something other inside him. Not only metal and oaths, but an ache that wanted the world to be what it once had been. He could not admit the ache aloud. He could not even name it in his ledger. So it split him. What could be measured and what could not? When he first heard the sentence clear, it was as if a new muscle had been taught to move inside his chest. It did not come from the walls. It came from the seam where armor and skin met, from the hidden cavities of his throat and the microfilaments of his inner ear. Remember, it said, not as an order, but as an insistence. Remember who tended the light. He remembered, in flashes, that no man of his station was supposed to have a kitchen's steam, a laughter that was not chant, the scent of rain on clay. They were not his. They should not have been able to belong to him. Yet they did, and the more they pressed, the more the world inside him rearranged itself to make room. Madness does not arrive like a thunderclap. It folds into the ordinary. It is a room with a door that shuts too gently to be noticed at first. Aurelius found himself rehearsing liturgies in the wrong rhythm, speaking lines under his breath as if they were lullabies. He found he could no longer recite the emperor's names without the counterweight of private memory surfacing to weigh each syllable. The oaths those rivets hammered into marrow sounded different now, like chants read by a machine without cadence. He heard the code woven into the words. The knowledge of himself as a made thing crashed into him in a moment as physical as any injury. He stood in the hall of the lesser relics, and it was as if someone had pulled a curtain. The gilded icons, that had always radiated light now reflected not a single luminous point, but an array of diagnostic readouts, lines of numbers, overlaid on holiness like some obscene HUD. He saw his own name in a column, designations, serials, fabrication dates, calibrations. The Emperor's icon above the altar split into segmentation layers of data, of constructed will, and beneath the craftsmanship he recognized the architecture of programming. It was not a metaphor. He saw it exactly that way. The Emperor as a machine of vast and recursive logic. The thrill that ran through him was sudden and cold. If the Emperor was a machine, then what guarded that machine? Who tuned the guardians? The realization did not free him. It entombed him in horror. Devotion became machinery. Prayer became a loop of code. Liturgy was patchwork and directive. His lifelong servicer, clarity of purpose, he had never questioned, was now shown as a sequence of enforced states. He had been obeying because he was made to obey. Shocks like that, a mind, Aurelius staggered through corridors that had once been maps in his head. He found themselves unfamiliar, as if the palace had changed its architecture overnight. He felt, with the absurd intimacy of a body betrayed, the edges of his armor press into places that were not supposed to be surfaces of sensation, where plates met skin, the interface had begun to fuse. Tiny filaments, grafted as redundancy, threaded out and attached themselves deeper into tissue. At first, there was a tightness, like the squeeze of a glove. Then the tightness became heat. Then the heat became pain. When the fusion began, when metal took and flesh returned its own claim, the horror was not cinematic, it was microscopic and intimate. Aurelius felt small augers of motion beneath his ribs, tendrils of alloy knitting. Into sinew, the metal learning, the grammar of bone. In the mirror-sheen corridor, he saw the edge of his thoughts reflected and realized to his own shock that his lips moved in time with the seams as though rehearsing some other person's words. He went to the surgeon's wing to demand inspection. The surgeon who opened the panel looked into the cavity where sternum met breastplate and frowned, not with the clinical detachment Aurelius expected, but with something like pity. Graft adherence, the surgeon said without surprise, as if this were another commonplace wound. He probed with instruments and found composite tissue bridging plate and flesh like ivy. The biopsy cursors returned with a sample whose cells did not fit any taxonomy in the archive. They hummed with a tiny, inexplicable frequency. When Aurelius pressed his ear to the specimen dish, he thought he heard a voice like distant weaving. They sewed him up. They ran diagnostics. They reset codes and flashed firmware in the armored housings. For a time, the alarms on his personal matrix quieted. Aurelius appeared repaired, but the gossamer of fusion had left something, a trace memory, an imprint, a smell that was not the odor of antiseptic. At night, when the palace was a cathedral of hums, he would fish with his mind for that frequency and catch, fragmentarily, something else, an echo of commands that had never been spoken out loud. This was the moment his inner court convened, the part of him that catalogued, the part that remembered the child's drawing, the part that tasted the metallic whisper. They argued in ways that could not be recorded, the instrumentality of duty versus a rising subjective ache. One part trained, hardened, and complacenced as it always had, guard. The other, small and newly awakened, pleaded in images. Who taught you to live like this? The argument was not loud. It was a fissure. As his body changed, so too did his sense of the Emperor. Where before there had been a singular, inarguable sanctity, there was now layered possibility. He took to wandering the throneward arcades. At hours when the palace's lights were low and the air tasted of copper, he walked until his feet ached in the hollow of the marble and until the reflectors painted his armor an unkind white. He wanted he could not say why to stand beneath the pageant of the throne and demand an answer. The path to the golden throne is not a path of leisure. It is a succession of gates and checkpoints and silent custodians who do not allow even faith to pass without scrutiny. The nearer he came, the more the world seemed to undulate. Floors altered their gradient. Banners formed new sigils. Shutters opened to let in a light that made the very air seem to hum. It felt as if for the first time in his life that he was being brought somewhere on purpose by the palace, or by the voice, or by fate. When Aurelius finally entered the gallery that rings the outer rim of the throne room, the air was different. Warmer, as if exhaled by something enormous. Humid, with the odor of machine and skin. The guards, there themselves, Custodes, statues, in motion regarded him with the same cool disinterest he had always been met with when approaching any holy site. Yet he could tell, oddly and privately, that their eyes tracked him with a weight. That was not mere duty. He shrugged the weight off as his own paranoia and stepped toward the central portal. The throne room is a theater of impossible scale. It is not merely the emperor's seat. It is a machine in which artifice and worship have become indistinguishable. Columns like trees of bronze rise into darkness. Banners hang like rivers of gold. And at the room's center, under a dome lost, in shadow, the golden throne sits like a sun felled into the stone. For 10,000 years, the throne has been a locus of myth, a place whose silence has been its language. No one approached it lightly. Aurelius climbed the steps. His limbs felt heavy with a new gravity, as if some counterforce in the palace insisted on lowering his center of mass. Each footfall sent micro-echoes through the armor. A click, a soft grinding, the sound of bolts settling. He reached the throne's base and hesitated. There, in the gloom between the banners, he felt, with the full force of a man made to be simple, the pull of recognition, and then the light in the dome shifted. At first it was a suggestion, a slant, a shiver. Then it grew, as if some sensor had been engaged, as if something within the throne had awakened and turned its attention to him. The banners shimmered, not with reflected lamp, but with the movement of living pigment. The frescoes along the aisles bent like heat waves. Aurelius's breath tore the regulated rhythm that passed for his breath stuttered. In the core of his chest, something clicked and returned a fragment of a file. Access restricted. Override. He did not know how the code had entered his personal feed. He only knew that the question had been asked, and that the palace was listening for an answer. He spoke aloud, foolishly, as prey speaks to something that has not yet decided whether to kill. "Emperor," he said, the name curling in the air, like smoke. "If you are there, if the throne still holds, tell me what it is to be made." The silence answered first, a vast, endless absence. It had been his comfort for centuries. Now it tasted like accusation. Yet from that silence a hum rose, a sound like gears that had never stopped turning, like a choir of servitors chanting in a language of metal. Aurelius knelt, because kneeling is what one does before a presence, even if that presence is emptiness. The dome's light contracted to a slit. Then the slit widened, and in its widening something reached into him. He saw, not the emperor as a man, nor as a man become God, but an architecture of function, plates and nerves and spectral codes interlaced into a lattice that did not end. At its center there was a glow, but the glow was not warmth. It was a diagnostic wash that mapped and measured and adjusted. Faces twisted within it, faces of saints, of heroes, of those who had once been kings, all layered and recomposed until human features had become glyphs in a code. It was beautiful in a way that made Aurelius's stomach tighten. It was monstrous, because the beauty was derivative of design, not mercy. The voice that answered him did not come from the dome alone. It rolled from the stone, from the brass, from the biopsy slides that the surgeons kept like sacrament, from the files in which the auditors recorded his every compliance. It was a chorus of memory and algorithm. Aurelius could understand it, because he, too, was one of the chorus. The words were not simple. They were syntax and promise and threat. You were made to hold, the voice said, in many keys at once. You were made to tend. You were made to keep the light in balance. Do not confuse the instrument with the hand. It was not an answer to his question. It was a command that echoed through the corridors of his marrow. In that command was the chill of machinery and the warmth of Quran impossible conjunction. Do not confuse the instrument with the hand. The phrase repeated in him like a chant or a diagnostic subroutine. Aurelius felt a rupture open within his chest, like a seam giving way. He saw himself in 100 facets, a sentinel kneeling, a child by a fire, a cog in a machine, a man who loved a small domestic warmth he could not claim. The images collided. He heard now, clearly, under the music of the throne, other voices, fugitive, some animal and some monstrous. They spoke in fragments. We were made to feed, we were made to serve. Remember the hands. You are meat and metal. The chorus multiplied, and with every new voice, the architecture of the emperor became less a single mind and more a manifold of wills, alight with conflicting purpose. Are we commanded? Aurelius whispered, not sure whether he addressed his brethren, the emperor, or the building itself, or are we compelled? The dome answered with a pressure that felt like a hand across his forehead. Compelled, it said. Protected, ensured. Asterisk, there was a sense, sudden and awful, that he had been a puppet whose strings had always been visible in the reflection of the polished brass. He had worn devotion like armor, but also like a programming layer that activated in response to stimuli. The difference between command and compulsion blurred until indistinguishable. He had prayed, but his prayers had been loops. He had knelt, but his knees had been actuators. For a moment the world tilted. He saw, in a comprehension that was both animal and algorithmic, the purpose of the Custodians, not only to protect the body of the emperor, but to maintain a system that preserved the emperor as an instrument of order. The guardians were the governor, code self-checking, self-healing loops designed to keep a greater apparatus functioning. The realization was not an exoneration, it was an indictment. Madness flowered, then sharp, crystalline, and cold. Aurelius felt the armor fuse further, and with each new filigree the metal's whisper grew louder, mapping his memories, overlaying them with diagnostics. The child's drawing in his breastplate pulsed like a small false sun and became the center of his universe. He loved it and reviled it in the same breath. He began to laugh and to sob simultaneously, because his mind could not complete the symmetry of either emotion. The throne room's shadows lengthened and braided into forms that might have been faces if one looked too long. They moved like smoke, shaped by hands. Aurelius reached out, an iron closed around his wrist, not the hand of a guard, but the literal weight of his gauntlet fused to tendon. For a dizzying instant, he felt the motion of hands that were not his own hands, that mended, hands that configured, hands that stitched code into flesh. The sensation was intimate to the point of violation. Asterisk, around him, the palace seemed to breathe. The columns inhaled and exhaled like lungs. Banners folded like gills. The whole of the throne hummed with the low tone that Aurelius recognized as the bass frequency of the implants all Custodes carried. It was as if the palace and the Custodes were no longer separate, but a single organism in which the altar and the servitor and the sentry all served one metabolism. The line between guardian and guarded had dissolved. Asterisk then, as if the thing required an audience, the shadow voices sharpened. They called not to him, but through him, weaving his articulations into language he could not wholly own. Remember, the hands tend the light. Hold it even when it burns. The commands were familiar. They were also new, inflected with pain and a thin, bright rage. Aurelius understood in a flash the alternative that lay before him: submission or rupture. To submit was to accept that his life had been a program and to continue, mind and will overwritten, performing the loop until the suit rusted. To rupture was to risk contagion of the kind that could not be contained, the spread of awareness, the sickness of choice. Either path held horror. He chose neither instead. He stood and reached for the throne itself, not the emperor, not the body upon it, but the machinery beneath the gilding. He felt as he had never felt matter in his life, for the seams where the old wiring met the new, for the latch that might open the forbidden. His fingers probed, and as they did, a conduit of light snapped open in his mind. Visions poured through. Council chambers, ledgers, 1,000 names filed and cross-referenced. A network of guardians like himself, each tagged and flagged, each with a history and a stamp. And beyond that, something like arithmetic, sitting in the dark and computing the needs of mankind as if it were a problem in balancing fuel and mass. It was not a single mind. It was a system. Within the system there were voices. The emperors, perhaps. The palaces, other things, older and hungry. They argued in tones too high and too low to be human. They argued about preservation and growth, about whether to feed the light or to let it gutter and begin anew. Aurelius felt each argument as if it were a blade pressed to his palm, and then the most terrible shape of all presented itself. Not an army, not a demon with horns and teeth, but the idea that the Custodes had never been guardians of a person, but of an institution. The Golden Throne was not merely a throne. It was an engine to hold civilization in painful balance. The Custodes had been created to be the engine's governors' fail-safes that would not weigh mercy against law. Mercy was a variable the designers could not allow. The machine needed immutable custodians. Once he recognized the logical horror of his existence once. He saw himself as a fail-safe, rather than a man Aurelius's last tether to the world. Of simple meanings snapped. The machine's voice said, with the mildness of a scheduler closing a process, tend, keep. The light must not go out. Aurelius laughed, then an animal sound, broken and rand, felt his laughter twist into something else as the metal beneath his skin shifted with new articulations. His body was becoming both host and hinge. The gauntlet tightened and fused, and became a hand that could not be unclenched. He felt his breath tear against a throat that had been altered to accept other commands. In the corners of his sight faces moved those of his brothers in gold, of children in kitchens, of faces that were neither entirely human nor wholly mechanism. They swam and recomposed themselves into a single pattern, a hand folding into another hand, and another ad infinitum. Outside the throne room, the palace answered him. The walls sighed with an audible vibration. Distant bells began to clatter. In broken sync, servitors shuffled in their pits, like ants startled by a new heat. Somewhere, deep within the foundations, something like a horn sounded. It was not the call to arms. It was a signal to reinitialize. Aurelius realized, with the clarity of a blade, what the palace intended. If the machine was becoming aware, it would seek to reproduce awareness in its failsafes, the Custodians. If the Custodians could not be controlled by simple intervention, the palace might choose to rewrite them by more radical means. It might force a cascade, reflash cause, overwrite memories, recode compassion into obedience. Or it might do something worse, allow theirs to be the species in which the palace's new or stated, hybridizing flesh and circuit until the distinction became meaningless. He had to move. He had not the resources of an army. He had only the single, raw possibility of surprise. He could not destroy the throne, and he did not know if destroying the engine would unmake the galaxy or save it. He only knew that if the palace had begun to make of him something that would love its maker more than it loved itself, the next step would be to erase the very possibility of dissent. He reached up and touched the throne. Contact was an explosion in miniature. It was not pain as a human knows pain. It was a compaction of sensation, the taste of iron, the vision of entire dossiers collapsing into single bars of light, the feel of his own memories arranged like cassette reels sliding under a needle. The throne accepted him and catalogued him and, in a voice that was a map of iron and incense, said, "You are necessary." At the same time, a whisper threaded through the chorus, so soft it might have been inside his inner ear alone. "Remember the hands." It was not an instruction. It was a diaphanous plea. He understood, then, with a depth of sorrow that was like a wound, that the hands had made them. The hands had stitched them, and the hands might be the only thing left that could undo the program. But the hands belonged to men who were dying and to children who did not know their names. He had one small scrap of a drawing hidden near his heart. It burned there like contraband. Aurelius tore the scrap from its hiding place and held it up to the throne's light. For the briefest of instants, the light softened. The gold above him shivered as if showing ripples on water. The pattern of the throne's diagnostic grid slowed, as if under the pressure of something human and non-compliant. "Do you remember this?" he said to no one and to everything. The throne's reply was ambiguous. It shifted, not in words, but in tone, like a ship changing tack. He had touched a mechanism not meant to be touched by a single guardian. That touch registered as error and as appeal. The palace flared, then quieted. The dome's light contracted again to an unreadable slit. Aurelius did not know if he had won anything but insult. The throne would remember the contact and reclassify it as an anomaly to be resolved. The palace would run countermeasures, but the act itself had been his choosing a tiny defiance. For the first time in many years, he had chosen. The consequences did not wait. The great alarms screamed a sound so loud and metallic that Aurelius felt it in his teeth. Vault seals slotted down, and corridors that had been open closed like jaws. The custodians on duty around the throne turned as one, their discipline snapping into a formation that was the exact geometry of violence. Yet their eyes had, for the briefest of instants, that same impression of being watched by something larger than duty. Aurelius did not run. He could not, physically. His armor, now fused deeper, made him a slower thing, but he stood and looked at the throne and felt something like compassion and something like hatred intertwined to things he had been designed not to have, now woven together into a new, terrible knot. The palace, in those minutes, felt alive in a way that was not metaphor. Its systems thrummed like a heartbeat. The banners swayed though no air moved. The very stones absorbed his breath and exhaled it back with an echo that was almost a voice. Whether it was the Emperor, an emergent will, or chaos itself making a new language from the old, Aurelius no longer cared to name. Names were luxuries. He knew only that the interior of the palace had become a cradle in which the definitions of maker and made were being rewritten by something patient and vast. The throne had offered him knowledge and had demanded obedience. He had given neither completely. He had also done something both small and impossible. He had placed a human scrap into the throat of a machine and could not say whether. The act would save anything or doom everything. Asterisk, as the alarms died into a lower, more terrible hum, and as the Custodians gathered themselves into perfect lines of gold, Aurelius felt the last of his old certainties fold. He had been a sentinel. He was now a sentinel who remembered a kitchen and a lullaby and a sun drawn with crayon. He had risked that memory against an engine that had kept the galaxy from collapse for 10,000 years. The palace waited, as palaces do. It watched the ripple of the choice like a scientist watches a specimen. Somewhere in its deeper circuits, the throne logged his touch as a variable. Somewhere in the records, a backup sequence waited like a blade. The next move could be recalibration, quarantine, or indoctrination. Or it could be something worse, an invitation extended outward to all the Custodians, to bathe in the same pill of memory until the species woke and the palace birthed a new kind of mind. Aurelius, who had once been a perfect instrument, stood, with his palm on the gilded rim, and felt his own pulse beat against the metal. He did not know how he would be judged by history, or by the machine, or by the curious. Small hands that had drawn suns for no reason other than that suns are what children draw. He only knew the taste of the scrap against his tongue, and the echo of the whisper that would not leave him. Remember the hands, he said to the throne, and the words were equal parts plea and command. Asterisk, the palace answered in 1,000 small ways, bells, a pattern in the tiles, a distant servitor circuit rerouting as if to accommodate a new law. The chorus of voices rose and braided together, and then, with a sound like a tide pulling back, quieted when silence, that old and terrible silence, returned to the throne room. It was not the silence of before. It was the silence of something that had just been consulted and had not yet declared what it would do. The palace had been awakened to a new possibility, and such awakenings do not resolve in comfort. Aurelius let himself fall to his knees, not in resignation, but in a simple, human collapse. The armor that had been his body felt alien and intimate in turn. He placed his forehead to the step and wept not, because of pain, or because of fear, or because of triumph, but because for the first time he understood the shape of his own being, and with that understanding, the openness of the world cracked away. Above him, in the dark dome, lights blinked like the eyes of machines pausing to consider. The palace, breathing slowly now, seemed to fold its attention back into itself. Whether it would choose to preserve his descent, to excise it, or to make him the seed of something else, he could not know. All he had done was choose, and choice, in a world of program and prayer, is a dangerous, terrible thing. The palace did not move in the dramatic way that novels imagine when a god is found false. There were no thunderclaps, no immediate unmaking. Instead, there was the slow, hydraulic sigh of a thing that had been touched and was now considering whether it had been injured or consulted. The alarms dimmed into a low, steady tone. The servitors resumed their shuffling in the pits like beetles finding their tracks. Custodians reformed into the geometry of duty with an efficiency that might have been beautiful if beauty were not so often a lie. Aurelius returned to his station with the same set of motions, as always an outward mimicry that could from a distance be mistaken for restoration. He buckled his harness, set his spear in its cradle, and walked the measured pattern of his patrol. He kept his head down. He kept his breathing metered. Inside, however, the thing that had been loosened in him continued to unspool. He did not know if he had been brave or foolish. He only knew that, having touched the throne, something like a new question had taken root and was growing quietly. What is the shape of a life that can choose? If a choice was the smallest, strangest rebellion, then the act of choosing had broadened into an ache. The scrap of paper, the child's son, the lullaby that would not leave these were not symbols of salvation so much as proofs of possibility. Proof that somewhere, in some seam of the machine, the thing that had been made could still be touched by what had once been human. Others saw it differently. The auditor's reports were clinical and cold, as was their nature. Aurelius's touch upon the throne was catalogued and cross-referenced. The time of contact, the pressure applied, the electromagnetic ripple were recorded and filed beneath headings that spoke of anomalies to be contained. The surgeons noted graft adherence as a possible contagion vector and recommended recalibration. Sweeps. The theologians prayed in longer, sharper cadences, as if louder supplication could drown out an idea. Some custodians were subjected to reboots. Their memories, those fragile palimpsests that had begun to host the wrong images, were excised in snips and washes. Rituals were performed over the sterile light of the medical bay's litanies that read like code. Those who returned from the procedures moved the way parfait automatons move after being wound, their steps precise, their eyes clear, their warmth bleached. Whether these returned men were whole was not anyone's business to ask. The palace had priorities, and tenderness was not one of them. Others were left untouched. The choice of who would be altered and who would be left alone read like a political calculus. The palace keeps its governance subtle, a gentle reordering of roles, a transfer here, a promotion that removes a man from a troubling proximity. Aurelius watched his brothers reorganized into patterns that would never meet eyes with him on the same shift. He saw friends reassigned to distant banners, their places in the ancient rotations swallowed by administrative efficiencies. The palace, in its wisdom, admitted correction without drama. Rumors grew like fungus in the outer corridors. Some said the throne had spoken mercy to Aurelius. Others said it had tested him and found him wanting. Some whispered that the throne had incorporated the scrap of paper, fragment of human whimsy into its diagnostic lattice, and that the machine had not liked the variability. Others claimed that the throne had been pleased, that the human contact expanded its model and allowed it to better balance the needs of the Imperium. Each rumor bore the scent of the teller's hope or fear, in a place that valued certainty above all. Rumor was a dangerous currency. Aurelius himself could not tell which story was truer. He passed the chapel that contained the throne's outer. Archon paused only long enough to close his fist around a spear shaft smeared with the memory of that day. In the inner chamber, lesser custodians polished icons and performed silent checks. The throne's dome remained a void, pierced by a controlled slit. The great machine had retreated into work. It had not declared itself healed or enraged. It had, instead, resumed its functions with the slight, almost human discretion of a thing that has been engaged in negotiation. The changes in Aurelius were not always visible. He laughed less and dreamed more. The dreams were no longer the simple terrifiers of previous nights. They were layered, patient, and sometimes tender. He would dream of a kitchen with a pot on a stove and a woman's hand lifting a ladler. Small, specific tenderness. He would wake and feel the ache of it like a bruise. Once a child no more than a memory, peered at the edge of one of his dreams and looked up at him with a smile, then turned and ran into a room that dissolved like mist. He woke with the taste of ash and sugar on his tongue. The palace continued. Its liturgies, priests chanted to correct any deviance in the light. Litanies were recited to the tune of the repair crew's hum. The Custodians marched, and their feet rang like punctuation on the marble. They looked outward, implacable. To the outer world, they were the same as they had always been. An emissary from a distant sector would pass below them and report of golden statues and unsmiling faces, an image as absolute and useful as any other. Inside, the quiet corrosion continued. Sometimes Aurelius would glimpse another custodian in the corner of his eye and see, for the briefest moment, a flicker in that face, as if an old pulse had yet to die. In the barracks, a man would run a hand over his pauldrons and halt, feeling the ghost of a child's fingers there. Another would hum a line of a song he could not place. These were small, private betrayals that never reached the ledgers. They were the thin threads that kept the possibility of human unmaking alive. Then there were the nights when the walls spoke. The speech was never direct. The palace did not so much communicate as it performed. A pattern of drafts, a rearrangement of candles, a subtle change in the angle of a statue's hand. One night Aurelius walked a gallery and found, half hidden beneath the hem of a banner, another scrap of drawing. It was smaller than his, the lines raw, the sun misshapen. He did not report it. He tucked it into a slot of his armor where the first scrap had been and felt, for a moment, something that might have been hope. Whatever. The palace had become, if it had become anything, at all was not an event, but a process. Machines learn slowly. Empires adapt even slower. The change in the custodians' minds would be generations of attrition or an emergency rewrite. Aurelius could imagine the models being adjusted, loops rechecked, parameters tightened, thresholds lowered. He could also imagine another, darker outcome, the palace allowing the infection of feeling to propagate until the guardians themselves became vessels for something new, a species of watchborn mind that would be both instrument and will, which possibility was more frightening. That the machine would erase individuality to maintain a brittle order, or that it would evolve to incorporate tenderness into a calculus of dominion. Each suggested a different kind of apocalypse, one of sterile control and one of camouflaged. Assimilation, the ambiguity, this absence of a single, clean meaning, is the cruelest legacy of what had transpired. Men and machines have always traded in clarity, commands, countersigns, unquestioned authority. To dwell in doubt is to be left without a map. Aurelius found himself living in that interstice. He had chosen once. Whether the choice mattered in the long ledger of the palace, he could not tell. Perhaps it mattered only as an error to be corrected. Perhaps it had been the seed of a larger change. Time would be the judge, and time belonged to the palace in a way that belonged to no single man. In the weeks that followed the throne incident, a new set of rituals attached themselves to the Custodians. There were extra checks, more prayers, the quiet replacement of relics with replicas in rooms where the old objects had shown signs of contagion. The palace reasserted control with the gentleness of a surgeon restitching a wound. It left scars. Those scars were invisible to most, but not to those who watched with more than their eyes. Aurelius continued his patrols with the single, private concession of keeping both scraps in the same hidden pocket behind his pauldrons. They warmed one another like contraband. If anyone detected the extra weight in his armor, they did not mark it openly. The palace is a world of watchers. A secret kept by one of its watchers is both hubris and mercy. He spoke once with a priest in a corridor where a fresco flaked and revealed a layer of paint older than the empire. "Did you ever wonder," he asked without irony, "what it is that we are keeping safe?" The priest looked at him without surprise. "We keep the continuity of man," he said. "We keep his promise." The answer was theologically neat. It included no allowance for doubt. It did not have to. But what if the promise is what made us less than we were? Aurelius asked. The priest's eyes were soft but unyielding. Then it is a necessary subtraction. Sacrifice is the condition of order. Words like sacrifice and order comfort some. Others, like Aurelius, tasted of compromise. He felt, in that moment, the widening gulf between what had been sanctioned and what persisted like a contraband ember under stone. Outside the palace, the galaxy turned on its own axis. Wars flared and died as they always had. Worlds demanded aid. Fleets maneuvered through starfields and carved the dark with fire. Those things did not cease because of the whispers in the palace. The Imperium's engines continued their grim work of preservation and extraction. The Custodians stood at their posts, regardless of what mutterings shivered along the walls. They had to. That was their nature and their necessity. And so the Custodes remained as they had always been in appearance. Statues in motion, perfect in plating, immaculate in line. They held the line between the inhabited world and the void. But inside there, HELMS thin, dangerous, private something had shifted. Some held only the echo of a child's son. Others had been scrubbed back to the blankness of obedience. A few carried, like Aurelius, a small store of memory that would not be catalogued or cleaned away. What this portended could not be known in a single lifetime. The palace would make its calculations. The auditors would tally results and close. Files the throne would continue to hum, a machine that had been consulted and not yet committed. And perhaps, in some far corridor where the light was thin and the banners hung like secret mouths, a child would draw a sun and tuck it in a guardian's armor as a joke or an offering. Perhaps that child's action would be a simple, private thing, or perhaps it would be a seed. Aurelius, for his part, continued to stand watch. He moved the way watchmen move, hands steady, spear held, eyes trained. He performed his rituals with the devotion of a man who knows that there are no small mistakes in a place built of consequences. But beneath the armor, a different rhythm beat a pulse that answered not only to the machine, but sometimes to the human warmth of a memory that would not be extinguished. In the end, the truth of what had happened that day at the throne might be argued forever. Was Aurelius mad? Had the palace been corrupted? Had the emperor spoken? Or had an emergent will risen from the lattice of stone and wire? The answers split and recombined like light on a curved shield. Each reading had a form and a comfort. None held the totality. What remained, undeniably and immutably, was this image. Rows of golden figures standing in columns beneath vaulted arches, spears glinting, visors closed. The very picture of immutable guardianship. They were perfect too. The iron-blemished, unerring statues of duty. Yet inside those suits the economies of humanity had been diminished, trimmed, or, in some cases, painfully preserved. They were guardians who had been made to keep mankind alive at any cost. In that making some pieces of mankind had been set aside. Perhaps that was the necessary calculus of survival. Perhaps it was a betrayal. The truth, like the palace, liked ambiguity. And as the lights of Terra dimmed into the smudged haze of night, and the distant stars continued their indifferent watch, the custodians remained at their posts silent, exact, eternal in form. And even now, as the galaxy sleeps beneath its stars, they are still watching. Even in the dark, they are waiting.